That morning, February 1st, 1387, Charles II of Navarre, surrounded as usual by a few favorites and a lazy retinue, hurried through the courtyard. The cool air cut his skin, and the familiar crunch of fine gravel, mixed with the dog excrement that littered the entire palace passage, crunched underfoot. The king had long since ceased to pay attention to such trifles. The court dogs had long since become a part of palace life, roaming wherever they pleased, while the servants lazily brushed off their work. Slipping on a fresh pile of feces right next to the central arch, Charles lost his balance with a hoarse cry, twisted sideways, and fell hard onto the stone step. There was a crunch. His left leg was deeply cut just below the shin. Blood gushed into his boot and flowed onto the stones. Several courtiers froze. 2 rushed toward the king, but immediately retreated, noticing the enormous palace dogs rushing toward the prostrate man from all sides. The dogs swarmed around Charles, sniffing the wound, greedily licking the blood, and the most persistent among them began literally rubbing against the exposed flesh as if it were their own prey. The nobles and servants stood stunned, silent. No one intervened, watching as the dog's fur and dirt rubbed into the monarch's fresh wound. One dog, the oldest, began rubbing directly against the bloody, torn skin. Charles couldn't even cry out. Shock and pain had robbed him of his will. Within minutes, the blood and dirt had mixed into a black liquid that had soaked into his clothes and skin. The servants stood rooted to the spot, unsure what to do. Only half an hour later, when the king himself attempted to rise, did one of the guards chase the dogs away with a stick. Charles was carried into his bedroom. He ordered no doctors to be called, muttering that it was just a scratch, and ordered everyone out. By the evening of February 1st, the wound had swollen, and the surrounding skin had become red and hot. The king, unable to tolerate interference, pulled off the boot himself, seeing the fabric stuck to his foot and a cloudy, viscous liquid appearing on the wound's surface. The servants peered fearfully through the door, but no one dared approach. That night, February 2nd, 1387, Charles couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in a fever, and every movement sent pain through his body. By morning, the swelling had spread to his knee. The wound was throbbing, the skin had darkened, and the smell from his bedroom had become so strong that even the old dog refused to enter. In that moment, it became clear the king's simple fall had turned into the beginning of a disgraceful and painful end. On the morning of February 3rd, 1387, a stench permeated the palace, impossible to conceal even with open windows or herbal brooms. Charles II of Navarre woke up bruised. His leg throbbed with a dull pain. The wound had swollen and turned a yellow-green tint, and the surrounding skin had become taut and shiny. The sheets had become soaked with a viscous liquid overnight, and despite the servants' attempts to change them discreetly, everything in the room quickly became stained with pus and blood. By this time, the king could barely even put his feet on the floor. Any movement caused a sharp increase in pain, causing him to become irritated and snap at everyone around him. Towards midday, Charles began to choke on his own pride. He refused to allow the court physicians even to examine his wound. Whenever they attempted to approach, he responded with harsh orders through third parties, demanding that no one interfere with his healing on his own. He spent increasingly more time lying on his back with his head thrown back, occasionally groaning loudly, but immediately ordered that no one be allowed near him. Those who attempted to approach fell under his suspicion. During his illness, the king became especially vindictive and intolerant, and could dismiss a servant or expel him from the palace the same day for so much as a glance. On February 4th, 1387, pools of murky pus reached the edge of the bed. The mattress was soaked to the springs, and dark stains spread across the wooden floor. To somehow mask the stench, the servants opened the windows, even in the bitter cold, causing thick layers of frost to form on the frames and curtains. The king ignored the complaints. On the contrary, he became suspicious, suspecting everyone of spying. He forced his servants to bring food only on silver trays, demanding that meals be placed right by the door and then immediately left. No one dared to stay more than a few minutes in his chambers. The air was thick with a putrid odor that clung to clothing and skin. Soon, even the court advisors avoided him, moving meetings to other parts of the palace. The herbal poultices administered by the maids at the behest of the senior valets brought no relief. Blisters filled with a cloudy fluid appeared one after another on the toes of the aching foot. the skin between them burst, releasing even more pus. Sometimes sheets covered in this discharge would stick to the skin and be torn off, bleeding, causing further wounds. Charles II showed no mercy. If a servant accidentally touched his foot, the king would fly into a rage and order the person replaced within hours. His behavior became unpredictable. He easily forgot yesterday's orders, but retaliated for the slightest infraction. On February 6, 1387, the stench from the royal bedchamber became so strong that it spread to adjacent rooms and even down the stone corridors. Soft carpets and tapestries accidentally contaminated by the pus were immediately ordered to be removed and burned in the courtyard, and those who carried out the work long remembered the pungent odor. Due to the constant dampness in the room, the sheets, mattress, and pillows quickly became stained with mold. Even the clothes brought to the king daily became saturated with the stench and did little to conceal his physical deterioration. During an attempted dinner on February 7, 1387, Charles jerked his foot sharply, accidentally hitting the edge of a bench, and a stream of thick pus erupted from the wound. Some of the pus splashed onto a servant's hands, a piece of dirty bandage fell to the floor, and a few more drops spattered the hem of the royal robe. At that moment, several courtiers left the hall, and some of those who remained barely held back their vomiting. Charles responded to all criticism with irritation. No one had the right to advise or even comment aloud. His arrogance only grew stronger as his condition worsened. As the night of February 7th approached, Charles II was unable to sleep. He was plagued by bouts of fever and chills, and his leg felt enormous and alien, as if filled with stone. During this period, no doctor dared to impose his opinion. Fear of the king overrode pity and common sense. Courtiers glanced warily at his bedroom door, trying not to even mention his name unless absolutely necessary. From that moment on, the court began to live as if separated from its monarch. Charles II, withdrawn into his own torments and suspicions, became a source of fear, disgust, and constant tension for everyone around him. Each new day brought increasing humiliation, not only to the king himself, but also to those around him. On February 8, 1387, the palace clock struck noon, but the palace was strangely quiet. Charles II was no longer able to get out of bed. His leg had swollen to almost twice its original size. The sheets beneath him were dirty and sticky. A foul odor emanated from his body, and the king himself had become even more irritable and distant. He categorically forbade opening the windows, even when the heat became unbearable. Servants now visited him one at a time and only on command, bringing food and a change of linen. But Charles himself spoke to no one. He no longer trusted even his closest associates, constantly watching their every movement, looking for signs of disrespect. On the night of February 9, 1387, the king's condition worsened. His face turned pale, his lips dry, his hand mechanically tugged at the blanket, which concealed his rotting leg. The skin around the wound had taken on a bluish-black hue, and dark spots began to appear on his toes. One of his maids, carelessly brushing the edge of the sheet, noticed that one of his toes had separated from his foot and remained embedded in the fabric. She quickly concealed this, fearing the monarch's wrath. Over the next 24 hours, Charles II barely ate. Silver dishes of bread and meat remained untouched on the table. He rarely drank water, which caused the skin on his face to become even drier. On February 10, 1387, a physician was called to his bedside, but upon entering, he immediately detected a pungent odor of decay. Charles lay with his eyes closed and showed no sign of interest in his surroundings. The physician examined the edge of the sheet, which had become fused to the wound. The sheet was torn off with difficulty, part of the skin coming off with it, and a viscous, bubbling substance poured out from underneath. The physician attempted to clean the wound, but the instrument slipped over the decayed flesh, exposing bone. At this point, the first flies appeared in the room. Attracted by the scent, they settled on the edges of the bandages and gathered in the folds of the blankets. Occasionally, tiny white worms could be seen on the windowsills and even on the walls, crawling out of the bandages and across the furniture. Charles II didn't react. He was half asleep, his mind wandering. Only when a maid's hand accidentally touched the wound did he shudder sharply, then began breathing heavily, turning away to the wall. Over these days, his character changed even more dramatically. He became absurdly suspicious. If a servant or maid lingered in his chambers for a few minutes longer than usual, Charles ordered them replaced, believing they brought illness. Several times he ordered the replacement of all workers who approached his bedside and banished some from the palace permanently. Even his closest entourage, the steward, the treasurer, the valets, now appeared in the room only when absolutely necessary. Each of them tried to carry out orders quickly, avoiding eye contact. On February 11th, 1387, late in the evening, an additional brazier filled with red-hot iron was installed in Charles II's chambers. The physician had decided to cauterize the ulcer, hoping to stop the spread of the rot. The atmosphere in the room became unbearable. The smell of scorched flesh mingled with the smoke. When the iron touched the wound, thick smoke rose from beneath the skin, and pus hissed, bubbling on the metal. Charles lost consciousness, but upon awakening, he began tearing at his bandages, scattered his linens, and repeatedly slammed his hand against the edge of the bed. The smell of scorched flesh lingered in the room for a long time after this procedure, and several of his maids fainted. That same evening, rats appeared in the bedroom. They scurried about in the dark corners and emerged as the night wore on, drawn by the remains of food and the smell of decay. The servants were forced to leave brooms of dried herbs in the room and keep coal stoves burning to repel the rodents. However, they were unable to rid the chambers of this scourge entirely. In the days when Charles II still retained his composure, he oversaw the movements of his people with particular severity. If one of his servants failed to carry out an order quickly enough, the king would gesture toward the door, making it clear that this person no longer had a place in his entourage. Any attempt to show concern or compassion was perceived as a personal insult. This led to rumors circulating in the palace that the king himself had become a danger to all who approached him. On February 12, 1387, flies and worms became a common sight in the bedroom, and some areas of the leg began to peel off, along with the bandages. Doctors and servants, changing the bed linen, tried to work silently and as quickly as possible, avoiding any unnecessary actions. The smell became so pungent that even behind closed doors, it was impossible to remain in the chambers for long. It could be smelled in all the nearby corridors. On February 13, 1387, tension in the palace escalated. Charles II could no longer stand and could barely move his arms. His entire lower body resembled a lifeless, rotting mass. The servants he had become accustomed to were afraid to approach him. The king now demanded that food be served only in silverware, but without even touching it, he would angrily overturn the dishes on the floor, soiling everyone nearby. Clothing was changed only when forced, because each new shirt immediately became saturated with pus and the stench of decay. When the maids clumsily attempted to handle the sheets, or accidentally touched his leg, Charles reacted not just with irritation, but with insult, throwing objects at them, hurling pillows, and even knocking over a chamber pot, demonstrating his superiority, even in this state. Late in the evening of February 14, 1387, the king's chambers were filled with a thick mixture of stench, smoke, and damp. Charles lay with his eyes closed, occasionally wincing in pain, but demanded that no one linger near his bed for more than a few seconds. Several times a day, he ordered new servants to be summoned and publicly humiliated the old ones, criticizing them for dirty clothes or unfair odors. The servants and attendants stopped arguing and tried to stay as far away from the bedroom as possible. They left food by the door, afraid to meet the king's gaze. The forced night shifts became a true ordeal for the men. Charles scattered scraps of food and dirty bandages across the floor and tore his linens, demanding immediate replacement. On the morning of February 15, 1387, the stench from his room permeated the entire south wing of the palace, and several courtiers fled their apartments entirely, fearing for their health. During these days, the king's humiliation reached its peak. Maids were forced to scrub the floor with their bare hands, and if someone hesitated or grimaced, Charles could order them to be flogged right in front of everyone else. He viewed doctors and apothecaries with suspicion, and if anyone lingered too long near a wound, they risked losing their position. No one attempted to show pity. Any attempt to help or ease the monarch's suffering resulted in a new bout of rage. The chambers where Charles II lived became a veritable no-go zone. The air was heavy and damp, the floor covered in traces of pus, bits of flesh, and dirty rags. Clean clothes were brought daily, but they immediately became soiled, and servants often found forgotten bandages, moldy sheets, scraps of food, bones, and the remains of rats under the bed, which had to be chased away all night. The rats no longer feared humans. At night, they climbed right onto the bed, gnawing on scraps of food, and sometimes drawn by the smell and pus, they scurried toward Charles's leg. The servants fought them off with sticks, but they were unable to rid themselves of this scourge. On such days, the king especially reveled in his power over those around him. He demanded new servants arrive daily, humiliating the old ones, ordering them to wash his feet with ice water or rub his skin with strong alcohol, without regard for the suffering of others. If a servant refused, they were immediately dismissed. Even his closest relatives did not risk appearing in his chambers. Several valets complained of constant nausea and malaise. Some left forever, fearing infection. Charles, however, did not even notice. By February 16, 1387, the situation had worsened. Due to the constant dampness and odor, mold had taken hold in the walls, and flowers and herbs in buckets in. The hallways were beginning to die. Even the powerful coal stoves which were lit to purify the air were unable to cope. Herbal brooms were kept in the bedroom, but the rotten smell only mingled with the aroma of bitter herbs. The king often cried out in pain, calling for his mother and the Virgin Mary, but when someone came to his aid, they humiliated them and drove them away with curses. His cries could be heard far beyond his chambers, and even beyond the walls, an atmosphere of anxiety and fear could be sensed. Gradually, most of the court retreated to distant rooms and chambers. Palace life began to take place outside the confines of Charles II's contaminated chambers. His name was uttered with caution, and servants conveyed orders through third parties. Even the guards no longer entered. Food and medicine were placed at the door and then quickly departed. Thus, day after day, the court became an isolated zone of fear, and Charles II completely lost his human face, becoming a source of humiliation, fear, and disgust for those around him. On the morning of February 17, 1387, Charles II's chambers were completely silent. Overnight, his body had changed beyond recognition. The skin on his leg had darkened, become thick and almost black. The veins had bulged, and his foot resembled a dry stump of wood. Any touch to the affected limb was accompanied by a crunching sound, as if the bone had become brittle and crumbled under the hand. The pus from the wound had given way to a thick, bloody mass that oozed slowly, leaving yellow-brown stains on the sheets. Thick scabs had dried on the bandages used to cover the ulcers. The doctors no longer tried to change them, fearing further bleeding. The servants no longer entered the bedroom at all. Food was left by the door, and linens were changed only when the king was carried away in his delirium. The windows were constantly wide open, but even the drafts couldn't dispel the heavy smell of decay. Everything Charles touched became coated in a brownish film, and sheets and pillows were thrown out into the courtyard immediately after use. Even the bedroom walls began to darken. Mold appeared in the stone joints, resistant to both herbs and stoves. Those closest to him tried not to utter the king's name, and those remaining in the palace continued to stay as far away from the infected part of the castle as possible. On February 18, 1387, Charles's condition became hopeless. His fever persisted, rising to its highest point. His face was covered in sweat, his breathing became labored, and his eyes turned a dull yellow. The king was delirious, often failing to recognize those around him, waving his arms restlessly, and sometimes scratching his chest and neck with his nails until they bled. The muscles in his leg twitched spasmodically, and gangrene had spread almost to his thigh. The smell became so unbearable that even the rats living under the bed began to leave the chambers. Servants wore rags, soaked in vinegar over their faces, and even doctors, accustomed to dealing with serious cases, tried to leave the room as quickly as possible, not lingering at the bedside of the dying monarch. Death occurred late at night, close to dawn. Charles II's body began to decompose rapidly. Within hours, his skin was mottled, and worms were emerging from the wounds and stitches. The sheets beneath him were darkened by thick secretions, and flies and beetles, which had previously been tried to be driven away, now swarmed over the corpse. By order of the steward, the royal bed was burned in the courtyard, along with its mattress and bedding. The bedroom walls were fumigated with bitter herbs, and the carpets were carried outside and doused with water. The windows remained open for 3 more days, but the stench of rot persisted. It seemed as if decomposition had penetrated every stone. A special coffin was made for Charles II. The lid was lined with thick leather and coated with resin to contain at least some of the internal vapors. The funeral was quick and unpretentious. With virtually no courtiers present, few dared approach the remains. Silence reigned over the grave. No one mentioned the monarch's accomplishments, and the older servants began calling him Rottenfoot. Even months after his death, the smell of decay lingered in the distant corridors of the castle, and the rooms where Charles II spent his final days remained empty for a long time. The aftermath of his illness and death reverberated long afterward within the palace. Many servants fell ill, some leaving service for fear of contagion. The palace kitchen and the south chambers had to be cleaned several times, and furniture and textiles associated with the late king were completely destroyed. Even chronicles of the time indicated that no one wished to remember the final weeks of Charles II's life. Fear and disgust lingered within those walls. Thus ended the life of a monarch whose name became a symbol of decay, humiliation, and hopeless pain for all who witnessed his final fall.